So here's a fascinating problem from the 1974 International Math Olympiad. At first glance, it might seem like just another polynomial inequality, but there's something genuinely beautiful hiding beneath the surface. We're looking at a relationship between how high degree a polynomial is and how many integer solutions it can have when the polynomial equals 1 or negative 1. The proof is going to take us on a journey through some really elegant number theory. Now, before we dive into the meat of this proof, we need to be really careful about what exactly this problem is asking. Mathematical precision matters here, and there are some subtle details that are easy to miss. So we start with a polynomial p of x, and the key constraint is that all of its coefficients are integers. Think of polynomials like x squared minus 3x plus 7, where every number you see is a whole number. The fact that it's non-constant is going to be really important in just a moment. Here's why that non-constant condition is so crucial. Imagine if p of x was just the constant function 1. Then for every single integer k you plug in, p of k would equal 1. That means n of p would be infinite, but the degree would be 0. Our inequality would become infinity is less than or equal to 2, which is obviously false. The same problem happens if p of x is constantly negative 1. So this non-constant requirement isn't just mathematical pedantry, it's absolutely essential. Now let's unpack what n of p actually means. We're counting how many different integers k make p of k squared equal to 1. Notice we're counting distinct integer inputs, not worrying about things like multiplicity. It's like asking, how many whole numbers can I plug into this polynomial such that the output, when squared, gives me 1? Now here's a key insight. Since k is an integer and all the coefficients of p are integers, p of k must also be an integer. So we're asking, which integers, when squared, give us 1? Well, that's easy. Only 1 and negative 1 work. So n of p is really counting all the integers k, where either p of k equals 1 or p of k equals negative 1. Let's break this down further. We'll call in sub 1 the count of integers k where p of k equals 1. And in sub 2 is the count of integers k where p of k equals negative 1. So naturally, n of p is just in sub 1 plus in sub 2. And here's what we need to prove. This seemingly simple inequality is going to require some genuinely clever insights. Now, your first instinct might be to reach for the fundamental theorem of algebra. After all, a polynomial of degree d can have at most d roots, so let's see where that naive approach takes us. Well, asking when p of x equals 1 is the same as asking when p of x minus 1 equals 0. That's a polynomial of the same degree as p, so it has at most degree of p roots. This means n sub 1 is at most the degree of p. By the exact same reasoning, p of x equals negative. 1 gives us p of x plus 1 equals 0, which also has at most degree of p roots. So in sub 2 is also bounded by the degree. So adding these up, we get that n of p is at most twice the degree of p. But hold on, that's way weaker than what the problem is claiming. The problem says n of p minus the degree is at most 2, which is much tighter. We're clearly missing something fundamental here. And here's where the real magic happens. There's a beautiful property that's specific to polynomials with integer coefficients, and it's going to completely change how we think about this problem. Here's the property that changes everything. If you take any two different integers a and b, then a minus b will always divide p of a minus p of b. This might seem like a technical detail, but it's going to give us incredible leverage. Let me show you why this is true. Let's say p of x is some general polynomial where all the coefficients c e sub I are integers. When we compute p of a minus p of b, we can group the terms in a really useful way. Now here's the key insight. For any positive integer k, we have this factorization, a to the k minus b to the k equals a minus b times some other expression. And crucially, when a and b are integers, that other expression is also an integer. Since each coefficient, c sub k, is an integer, every single term in our sum is an integer multiple of a minus b. And if every term in a sum is divisible by something, then the whole sum is divisible by that thing. So we've proven our property. Now comes the really beautiful part. Let's see how this seemingly abstract property gives us incredible insight into our original problem. Imagine we have some integer k sub I, where p of k sub I equals 1, and some other integer L sub j, where p of L sub j equals -1. Our divisibility property tells us that k sub I minus L sub j must divide p of k sub I minus p of L sub j. But we know exactly what p of k sub I and p of L sub j are, so k sub I minus L sub j must divide 1 minus -1, which is 2. And this is huge. The difference between any root where p equals 1 and any root where p equals -1 can only be -2, -1, 1, or 2. That's an incredibly restrictive constraint, and it's going to be the key to the entire proof. Now, we're going to use this constraint to show something really surprising. N sub 1 and n sub 2 can't both be large at the same time. The argument here is quite sophisticated, so let's work through it carefully. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that there are at least 3 integers where p equals 1. We'll call them k sub 1, k sub 2, and k sub 3, ordered from smallest to largest. Now suppose there's some integer L where p of L equals -1. Let's define v sub I as k sub I minus L. These v values are going to be the key to understanding what's happening. From our constraint, each v sub I must be in the set -2, -1, 1, 2. And since the k values are distinct, the v values must be distinct too. Here's where things get really interesting. The spacing between our k values can be expressed in terms of the v values. K sub 2 minus k sub 1 equals v sub 2 minus v sub 1. And similarly, k sub 3 minus k sub 2 equals v sub 3 minus v sub 2. But wait, there's something subtle happening here. The left sides of these equations are completely determined by our choice of the k values, but the right sides depend on L, which could potentially be different integers. How can both sides be equal for any choice of L? Well, let's think about this systematically. If we pick 3 distinct values from our set -2, -1, 1, 2, there are only 4 ways to arrange them in increasing order. And each arrangement gives us a specific pattern of consecutive differences. Now here's the key insight. The pair k sub 2 minus k sub 1, k sub 3 minus k sub 2 is completely fixed by our choice of the k values. This pair can match at most one of our 4 possible patterns. So there's at most one way to choose the v values that's consistent with our k values. And once we know v sub 1, v sub 2, v sub 3, we can determine L. Since v sub 1 equals k sub 1 minus L, we get L equals k sub 1 minus v sub 1. So L is uniquely determined. This gives us our crucial lemma. If there are at least 3 integers where p equals 1, then there can be at most one integer where p equals -1. The constraint is so restrictive that having many roots of one type severely limits the other type. Now we can put together the final proof using our lemma. Let's consider case 1. Suppose one of n sub 1 or n sub 2 is at least 3. Without loss of generality, let's say n sub 1 is at least 3. Our lemma immediately tells us that n sub 2 can be at most 1. So let's look at n of p, which is n sub 1 plus n sub 2. We can use our bound on n sub 2, so n of p is at most n sub 1 plus 1. But we also know that n sub 1 can't exceed the degree of p, so n of p is at most the degree of p plus 1. Rearranging this inequality gives us what we want. N of p minus the degree of p is at most 1. And 1 is certainly less than or equal to 2, so we're done with case 1. The same argument works if n sub 2 is at least 3 instead. For case 2, the only remaining possibility is that both n sub 1 and n sub 2 are at most 2. In this case, n of p is at most 4. If the degree of p is at least 2, then n of p minus the degree is at most 4 minus 2, which is 2, so we're good. If the degree is 1, then p is linear, and a line can cross the horizontal lines y equals 1 and y equals negative 1 at most once each. So both n sub 1 and n sub 2 are at most 1, giving us n of p at most 2, and the inequality still holds. And with that, we've covered all possible cases. The proof is complete. Before we wrap up, let me show you a concrete example that really brings this theorem to life, plus an interesting alternative way to think about the problem. Let's look at p of x equals x squared minus 5x plus 5. This is a degree 2 polynomial. Let's find where this polynomial equals 1. Substituting our polynomial gives us this equation, so we need x squared minus 5x plus 5 to equal 1. Let's move everything to one side. We get x squared minus 5x plus 4 equals 0. This quadratic factors nicely. We get x minus 1 times x minus 4 equals 0, so the solutions are x equals 1 and x equals 4. That gives us n sub 1 equals 2. Now let's find where p of x equals negative 1. Same process as before. We need x squared minus 5x plus 5 to equal negative 1. Moving everything to one side again, we get x squared minus 5x plus 6 equals 0. This also factors beautifully. We get x minus 2 times x minus 3 equals 0, giving us x equals 2 and x equals 3. So n sub 2 equals 2. So n of p is 2 plus 2, which is 4. And n of p minus the degree of p is 4 minus 2, which is exactly 2. So this example achieves the bound perfectly. The inequality can't be improved. Here's an interesting alternative perspective. What if we define a new polynomial q of x as p of x squared minus 1? Well, by construction, all the integers we're counting in and of p are exactly the roots of q of x, and the degree of q is twice the degree of p. This immediately gives us the weak bound we found earlier. N of p is at most twice the degree of p. But to get the much tighter bound we actually proved, we really needed that number-theoretic divisibility argument. It captures a structural constraint that this more direct algebraic approach completely misses. That's the beauty of this proof. It reveals hidden structure that you'd never see otherwise. I hope you enjoyed this journey through what I think is a genuinely beautiful piece of mathematics. There's something deeply satisfying about how a simple-looking inequality can hide such rich structure underneath. If you found this as fascinating as I do, I'd love it if you liked this video and subscribed for more mathematical deep dives.